We have always believed we know who we are. When we look in the mirror, we see a person with a name, a story, an identity. The feeling of being someone, of being separate from everything around us, is so deep that we hardly realize something is wrong. We are trained from birth to believe that we are a fixed self, an entity that has control over its thoughts, its decisions, its life. But what if this self we so firmly believe to be real is nothing but an illusion? Think about it. Where does the sense of being someone come from? It is not a physical presence, nor something you can touch, see, or measure. Neither scientists nor mystics from the past have been able to locate this essence of the self. They searched and still search in every corner of human experience, but they never found the self anywhere. So what hides behind this sense of identity? Is it possible that throughout our lives, we simply accepted an idea that is not ours? An idea that was given to us but never truly discovered. The idea of the self that we carry is nothing more than a collection of thoughts, emotions, and memories, a sequence of perceptions that constantly change. But then, what happens to the perception of who you are if this self is not real? For centuries, the search for the essence of the self has been an uninterrupted journey, led by philosophers and scientists who tried to understand what we truly are. David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, was one of the first to question the nature of the self. He stated that, upon searching for this fixed self, what he truly found was a collection of thoughts, feelings, and perceptions in constant change. The self, according to Hume, was not a singular and unchanging entity, but a sequence of disconnected experiences that connect only through memory to create the illusion of continuity. He challenged the idea that there is something fixed and permanent inside us that can be called the self, leaving a void where we once thought we found our identity. Millennia before, in ancient Eastern traditions, the concept of no self, or anatta, as Buddhists call it, also suggested that personal identity is not a fixed essence, but a temporary construct, something that arises and disappears over time. These teachings pointed to something profound. The sense of being an independent self is an illusion, a projection of the mind that strengthens throughout life but has no real basis. Today, neuroscience adds to these ancient discoveries, offering a more technical yet equally fascinating perspective. Scientists have tried to map the brain and find the command center of the self, an area where consciousness and identity originate. However, the results have been surprising. The brain, although highly complex, does not present a single point of origin for the self. Instead, what we see is a tangle of brain activities, with billions of neurons firing and interacting in a complex network. Emotions arise and disappear. Thoughts appear without warning, but there is no central self coordinating it all. Instead, there is only a constant neural activity, a composition of electrical impulses without a manager. We live in a constant attempt to fit our actions and thoughts into a predefined mold, a narrative that we follow without question. This narrative, however, is not formed by conscious decisions, but by a series of automatic reactions to the experiences and stimuli presented to us. The human mind, although complex and impressive in its capabilities, often deceives us by making us believe that we are in charge. It teaches us to see our existence as a sequence of deliberate choices, while in fact most of what we do is driven by unconscious mechanisms. The brain, with its networks of neurons and synapses, acts as a vast laboratory of automatic responses, which are activated even before our conscious perception enters the picture. When we take a closer look, we begin to realize that every thought, every impulse, every emotion, although it seems to come from us, is actually a response to external or internal stimuli that are beyond our conscious control. When we are faced with the idea that the self has no control, an important question arises. What remains? If we are not the ones moving the pieces on the board, if the narrative we believe to be ours is in fact an ephemeral construction, what exists in place of this illusion? This is where freedom comes in, the freedom to realize that life doesn't have to be forced to fit into a mold we've created. When we accept the fluidity of being, the perception of control loses its relevance. Resistance disappears, and with it, the tension that accompanies the constant effort to maintain a cohesive identity. Awakening to the illusory nature of the self frees us from the incessant search for external validation, from trying to sustain an image of who we think we are. The idea that we need to control our thoughts and actions begins to break down as we realize that life unfolds effortlessly, guided by a natural flow that transcends the individual self. The fixed self, that image we constantly seek to validate, dissolves in the face of the clarity that true freedom comes from accepting what already is, from accepting impermanence, constant change, and the absence of control. And if there is no self in charge, who or what is really in control? This is where we delve into the nature of our actions and decisions. Many of our actions happen before we are conscious of them, and this has been deeply studied by neuroscience. Research on brain activity has shown that the decision to move a finger, for example, is made in the brain several milliseconds before consciousness becomes aware of that decision. But you might be wondering, okay, what does this imply? Well, simply that the conscious self, the thinker we believe is responsible for our actions, actually only emerges after a series of neural processes are already underway. In other words, the brain is already doing before you realize you are doing it. The concept of control is deeply rooted in our perception of who we are. We live with the idea that we are the owners of our thoughts, emotions, and actions. Our thoughts arise without request. Our emotions appear unexpectedly, and our actions often take place before we are even aware that we are acting. In other words, the self that thinks it is in control actually only observes a process that has already begun. This challenges the idea that we have direct control over our actions. We think that we are the ones who decide to move a hand or take a step, but what scientific evidence shows us is that the conscious self is, in reality, a story that comes afterward, a narrative the mind creates to make sense of something that has already happened. The brain is actually telling the story of our actions as they unfold. When we believe we are actively making decisions, we are simply observing a process that already began before our consciousness entered the scene. And this perception of control, so familiar to us, begins to unravel in light of evidence that our actions may be more automatic than we imagined. So perhaps what we call decision is just a reaction to a chain of events that unfold independently of our conscious perception. From the moment we are born, we are bombarded with information about the world around us, and the brain begins to organize it, creating a story that tries to make sense of it all. As I said, this story is formed by our memory, the emotions we feel, and the perceptions we have had throughout life. But there is something important to note. This story is dynamic. It is not a fixed narrative. It is constantly being reconstructed. Memory, for example, is not a perfect and unchanging record. What we call memories are actually reconstructions the mind makes from fragments of experiences. Each time we access a memory, it can be altered, influenced by emotions or new events. And so, the story of the self keeps transforming without a fixed center to coordinate it. But the emotions and thoughts that arise at each moment also shape the self. They are temporary, coming and going without warning, but our mind integrates them into the continuous narrative of identity. When we feel fear, joy, anger, or happiness, our mind associates these feelings with a part of our story, creating an interpretation of who we are. But again, these feelings and thoughts do not remain stable. They are like waves in the sea, always changing. The result of this constant adaptation is the feeling that we are a cohesive self with a stable and permanent identity. However, this perception of continuity is an illusion created by the mind, which seeks to make sense of an uninterrupted flow of experiences. Every event lived, every interaction with others, and even our own thoughts are woven into this narrative we call the self. And if the self is a construct of the mind, who or what, in fact, is observing this whole story? Who is the I that sees the mind creating its thoughts, emotions, and perceptions? The answer to this question leads us to a fundamental concept: the observer. The observer is a broader and impersonal consciousness, which observes without getting involved. When we stop identifying with thoughts, emotions, and experiences, we begin to perceive this silent presence, which is always there, watching, but not part of the spectacle. Eastern philosophies like Zen and Tao have recognized this aspect of consciousness for millennia. Zen masters, for example, spoke about the concept of witnessing, a conscious presence that observes without judgment, without the need to make sense or form an opinion about what it sees. Tao, with its simplicity and depth, also points us to the idea of a natural flow of life, a quiet observation of life unfolding, without attachment, without effort. This observer is present in every moment, but it is not part of it. It does not interfere with sensations or emotions. It is not trapped in the thoughts that come and go. It is pure consciousness, which sees everything without merging with what is seen. When we realize this observer, we begin to realize that we are this consciousness observing all of it. This realization does not mean abandoning our experiences or thoughts. On the contrary, we can experience life more fully and vividly. However, instead of being swept away by the current of thought and emotion, there is a distance that allows us to observe clearly. Suffering diminishes because we are no longer so identified with what arises in the mind. Fear and anxiety lose their power because they are no longer ours. They are just transient phenomena that arise in the experience of consciousness. The true self, then, is what observes, silent and present. And the more we connect with this presence, the more we realize that we are, in fact, this observer beyond the limitations of the mind, beyond the constructions of the self. The impact of this awakening changes how we experience the world. When you realize the self is an illusion, a natural distancing begins to emerge between who you thought you were and what you truly are. This realization is not something magical, but profoundly liberating. For without a fixed self, you are no longer trapped in a story that needs to be defended, justified, or constantly validated. The inner struggle that accompanies belief in the self begins to dissipate because the idea of a fragile self in constant threat simply ceases to exist. And this realization brings clarity, a clarity that is not just cognitive, but existential. For this is something that frees us from many of the internal conflicts that define human experience: the fear of judgment, insecurity, the need for validation. What once seemed essential to identity, success, achievements, the image we project to the world, loses its weight. They become just transient events in the experience of life, without the emotional baggage they normally carry. This transformation does not imply becoming indifferent to life or losing interest in things. On the contrary, there is a new type of involvement with life. This transformation makes us more present, Life becomes experienced more vividly and immediately, without the filter of a self trying to control or defend its position. The need for control, predictability, and security begins to soften because you realize that life itself, with all its ups and downs, unfolds spontaneously. The lightness that arises from this understanding comes from a place of acceptance. Instead of fighting against the natural flow of things, you begin to live with it. Thoughts and emotions still arise, but you are no longer a slave to them. They come and go like clouds in the sky without you needing to hold on to them. Fear, once dominant, no longer has the same strength because you understand that there is no self to be hurt, judged, or defeated. Concerns about the future and regrets about the past lose their relevance because you begin to live in the present moment in a deeper way. Without the pressure to be someone specific, without the burden of the self constantly trying to protect itself, you finally find yourself free to live with more authenticity and inner peace. The weight we carry throughout life, trying to maintain a coherent image of who we are, disappears. And with it, the suffering that comes from this endless struggle also fades. For if there is no fixed self, there is nothing to be threatened, nothing to be hurt or destroyed. The tensions that arise when we feel attacked or misunderstood begin to lose their power. And when we realize that identity is not something that needs to be preserved, the need to protect the self from the world dissolves. No longer is there the pressure to always meet external expectations or to sustain an idealized version of who we think we are. The self that once seemed so fragile, so vulnerable, begins to reveal itself as an illusion without real substance. This realization brings with it a sense of freedom. Freedom to be who you truly are, without the shackles of self-image. Without the constant need to defend what we believe we are, we can finally relax. The stories the mind tells about ourselves, our flaws, achievements, and struggles, begin to lose their power. The cycle of self-judgment and the search for external validation diminishes. There is only an inner stillness, a peace that arises when we understand that there is no need to fight for an identity or to reach a specific goal to feel complete. This does not mean denying our experiences or our feelings. On the contrary, we are allowing them to arise and dissolve without being trapped by a fixed identity. Emotions still arise, thoughts continue to appear, but now there is a space between what happens and our response to it. We no longer cling to every thought or sensation as if they were part of ourself. They arise, but they no longer have the power to define us. What emerges after this deconstruction of the self is acceptance, surrender to what is, the freedom to be without the need to justify or explain. And in this space, inner peace becomes natural, not something we seek, but something we find when we stop resisting what already is. So the impact of this awakening is not just about what you leave behind, but also about what you gain, a new perspective on life. Life, which once seemed like a battleground, now reveals itself as an experience full of possibility and connection. And this changes everything. You enter a state of alignment with life, where the idea of fighting against what we are dissolves. And it is in this space of serenity that we experience true freedom, not the freedom of the self, but the freedom of being. Thank you for embarking on this journey with me. If this video resonated with you, I invite you to like and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with others so they can benefit from this message. And don't forget to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, reflections, and experiences. Thanks again for watching and for joining me. Take care and see you soon.